This story is shocking in its cruelty and injustice. Imagine a quiet night when one family's life was forever changed. Drunk, stupefied by hatred and old prejudices, a white police officers burst into the lives of a young brother and sister. His eyes full of anger were fixed on the defenseless black girl, and his hands shook with anger, ready to unleash a force from which there would be no escape. Only her brother, strong and resolute, dared to stand between her and tragedy. He knew that every moment could be his last. Feel the fear and despair of this night. Feel the injustice squeezing your heart. If this story touched you, please write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. We want to know who you are, because you are really important too. Your comments and support help our channel grow and tell stories that need to be heard. You are our family, our community, and we value each and every one of you immensely. Thank you for sticking with us. Your voice matters, and because of you, we continue to fight for truth and justice. We cannot express how much we care about you. It was one of those quiet summer nights when the air is filled with the fragrance of blossoming trees and a large moon shines in the sky, casting a pearly light on the quiet street. The small, modest house on the outskirts of town was peaceful. The windows were open, and a light breeze blew in, ruffling the white curtains as if trying to cool the warm room. There was quiet laughter in the house as brother and sister, Leila and Marcus, enjoyed a rare moment of simple happiness. Leila had just finished making hot tea, and Marcus was telling her funny stories from school, trying to pull her out of the embrace of the busy day. But this peaceful moment was as fragile as glass, ready to shatter at the first blow. Outside the house, beyond the invisible boundary of their personal tranquility, evil lurked, and that evil was already pacing the sidewalk, staggering, stumbling, and clenching its fists. It wore the uniform of a police force that was supposed to protect, but tonight, under the cover of night and under the influence of alcohol, was ready to destroy. Officer Baird, with a flushed face and eyes full of hatred, slowly approached. His racist hatred, tempered by years of prejudice and backed by a system that too often left such crimes unpunished, was boiling and looking for an outlet tonight. His mind was a mixture of alcohol, anger, and old prejudices. He didn't just hate, he despised. Hate fed him like a demonic flame, and in a drunken frenzy it became a dangerous weapon. These blacks, he muttered to himself, stumbling down the stairs. They don't deserve to live here like I do, don't deserve this freedom. His fist clenched tighter and his breathing quickened. In the house, Leila suddenly frowned, as if she had heard or sensed something disturbing. Her smile faded, and she met Marcus's gaze, who understood at once. Her brother's gaze turned serious, and they both stood in silence for a moment, as if anticipating the storm that was about to hit. There were heavy, angry footsteps outside their door, the threat that had come into their world to destroy everything they loved. Officer Baird's unsteady gait echoed through the deserted street like the echoes of impending calamity. His boots stomped roughly on the pavement, and each step seemed menacing. Subscribe to Depot Pro to edit this document. Visit www.depot.com Pro for more information. Adding an unbearable tension to the air, alcohol enveloped his mind in a thick, poisonous fog, in which reality and hatred melded together, creating a dangerous mixture. His dirty uniform, the smell of violence, and bloodshot eyes gave away his condition. This was a man possessed by demons of his own making. Baird stopped in front of Leila and Marcus's house. His gaze wandered to the dark windows, where he saw not just people, but those whom his racist hatred had incited in ugly images. Every fragment of his mind, imbued with generations of indoctrinated prejudice, whispered disgusting things to him. They'll never change, he thought, rubbing his stubbled jaw. Living here, breathing the same air, walking the same streets, as if they deserve the same things I do. This man's hatred was no accident. It was nurtured and nurtured by a toxic legacy passed down from generation to generation. As a child, he had heard his father speak proudly of the superiority of the white race, as neighbors shared in whispers a hatred tempered by fear. That hatred now possessed him like a dark spirit, and today, under the influence of alcohol, it was at its peak. Baird pulled his baton from his pocket, twirling it in his hands like an angry child about to destroy a toy he despised. His head was buzzing with grog, lending confidence to his own Power. Who are they to feel safe here? He thought with growing anger. To him, people in this house, the blacks who he felt had no right to safety and happiness, were just a problem to be crushed. The weight of his footsteps, his malicious thoughts, and the way he clutched his baton created an unbearable atmosphere of terror. In that silence of the night, broken only by his lusty breathing and the heavy sound of his footsteps, lurked a menace from which there was no escape. Baird stopped, raised his head, and stared at the house in front of him as if it were his personal enemy. Hatred exuded from him in almost palpable waves, and in that moment, the night seemed cursed. Inside the house, Marcus and Lila held their breath. Lila felt her heart racing in her chest, and her palms wet with sweat. They knew something terrible was coming, knew that the evil they had spent their lives trying to hide from was now just a few meters away. Lila felt like a little girl, lost again in a world that hated her only because of the color of her skin. She looked at her brother, and tears misted her eyes for a moment. Marcus, standing beside her, gritted his teeth and squeezed her hand tightly. He knew this night would be a test, but there was determination in his heart. He wouldn't let this evil enter their world, wouldn't let anger and racism destroy everything they loved. But no matter how steadfast he was, fear still crept up his spine with icy claws. Lila Saturday on the old, warm couch in the living room, wrapped in a light blanket that smelled clean and homey. A cup of tea trembled in her hands, but it wasn't the shiver of cold. Surrounded by the comfort of their small home, she tried to maintain a semblance of calm. Everything seemed normal this evening. The light laughter with her brother, the soft light of the lamp diluting the night's darkness, but something in that air suddenly changed. The invisible hand of fear slowly crept into the room, squeezing her chest. Lila was used to living with this feeling, this shadow of fear that was always somewhere nearby. She knew that her skin, her proud heritage, the things that made her unique in this society made her a target at the same time. Since she was a child, she had been taught to be careful, to keep her eyes open, to avoid unnecessary attention. She'd seen her parents' repeated fear of stopping the car on a dark street, how they avoided certain places, knew that their conversations about life often came down to how to protect themselves from a world that hated them for the color of their skin. She tried to distract herself by picking up her phone and scrolling through the newsfeed, but suddenly her hand frowned. There was a sound outside, the heavy thud of a boot hitting the ground, then another. Lila frowned, her heart beating faster, as if sensing an approaching threat. The sound was loud and rough, like the footsteps of a beast that had crept into their world. Her hand trembled even more, and the tea spilled onto the plaid, leaving a dark stain. She got up from the couch and went to the window. The dark streets, usually so quiet and peaceful, now seemed alien and hostile. The worst thoughts were running through her mind. She thought of all those who had not returned home after their encounters with the police. Those whose lives had been ripped from this world because of hatred and prejudice. Lila remembered the names that had become symbols of the struggle, but she also remembered the pain of the mothers and fathers whose children had not returned. Her fear became even deeper. Her eyes glanced nervously around the dark sidewalk, and that's where she saw him. Officer Baird stood in front of their house, his silhouette like a ghost coming to destroy their world. Even in the darkness, she could make out his dangerous figure, his uniform unbuttoned, crumpled from drinking, and the way he clutched his baton as if preparing to strike. Blood frowned in her veins. She knew she wasn't just seeing a man. She saw the embodiment of a system that for centuries had placed people of her color below the rest of the world. Embodiment of a fear they'd known since birth. Lila flinched away from the window, her heart pounding so loudly she thought she could hear it outside the door. Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't let herself cry. Not now, she whispered to herself, trying to suppress her panic. She glanced at her brother who stood beside her, his face tense but determined. There was everything in their gazes, fear, desperation, but also a bond that made them stronger. She knew they were together, but was it enough to stand up to a man who hated them for who they were? That night, when her peaceful evening suddenly turned into a nightmare, was a reminder that racism wasn't just a shadow of the past. It was here, in the present, ready to destroy, ready to take away. The sound of footsteps, heavy and sure, echoed through the silence of the night like an ominous echo, growing closer each time. Officer Baird was moving toward Leela and Marcus's house like a predator stalking its prey. Every step he took echoed in the air with a menacing warning that was impossible to hide from. He was like a monster unleashed from the depths of hatred, a monster who knew no pity, who lived in a world where his anger was considered power. Baird, drunk and angry, stumbled, but stayed on his feet. He swore, his voice hoarse and angry, as if he came from lips already poisoned with hatred. His baton slammed against his thigh, sounding deafening in the silence of the night. His every movement seemed a mockery to all those who believed in justice, an insult to all who hoped for equality. Only one thought pulsed in his drunken head: to show these blacks where they belonged. He felt no fear, only a burning desire to humiliate, to break, to destroy. The officer stepped up to the fence surrounding the house and put his full weight on it. A deafening thud echoed around the neighborhood, and behind the fence Leela shrank back in horror as if the sound had pierced her heart. Tears gathered in her eyes again, but she forced herself to stand straight. Baird, staggering, straightened up, and his gaze, full of hatred, stopped on the house. He saw the light in the windows, saw the white curtains swaying slightly in the wind, and the sight of it made his anger grow even more intense. "You think you have the right to live here like us?" he muttered, his voice filled with contempt. He knew that this house was inhabited by people he considered other, second-class people. Racism fueled his alcotoxin poisoned mind and made him see Leela and Marcus as a threat, simply because their existence challenged his warped world. Baird took a few more steps and stopped at the gate. He struck the iron bars with his baton, and the sound was as loud as thunder in the night. The sound was a threat, the embodiment of all the evil he had brought with him. Inside the house, Leela and Marcus frowned like fragile birds, realizing that the world they had worked so hard to protect was ready to collapse at any moment. Officer Baird grinned drunkenly. He loved this power, this sense of superiority he felt over defenseless people. He was a representative of the law, but this night was his personal time of reprisal. He didn't need reasons for all his anger. His rage was directed at these people simply for breathing, for existing. He clutched the baton so tightly that his fingers churned, white and his heart filled with the anticipation of power. For Leela and Marcus, every sound was like a blow to the chest. Every movement of the officers seemed like the beginning of the end. They knew that in this story they could become the next victims of the statistic, that their faces could become the next on the list of those who suffered because of hatred. But how do you defend yourself against such evil? How do you save your life when evil is not just around, but literally knocking on your door? The night was saturated with fear and despair. It was a reminder that evil and hatred still walk among us, that racism lives in the hearts of those who should protect but choose to destroy. Officer Baird stopped in front of the wicket, his body slightly staggered from the alcohol, but his eyes were crystal clear and focused on the house where Leela and Marcus lived. Those eyes were full of something deeper than mere intoxication. They shone with an angry light, a hatred that had been built up over decades, handed down with pride and hatred by the generations that had taught him to despise people of color. His eyes were red, bloodshot with both fatigue and anger. It was a look of unbridled rage, an unconscious fear of those he considered strangers. He looked at the house as if it were not just a cozy little corner, but a threat to everything he thought was right in his distorted world. He looked at the house as if it were a threat to everything he thought was right in his twisted world. There was pain in his eyes, but it was not the pain of suffering, but the pain of ingrained contempt. It was the legacy of the world he had grown up in, a world where white men were heroes and everyone else was the enemy or lower in the hierarchy. Every time he looked at people like Leela and Marcus, his mind screamed, "They are not my equal." And now, standing in front of their house, drunk and charged with the venom of hatred, he didn't see them as people worth defending. He saw them as enemies to be crushed. His gaze darted from one window to the next, as if searching for shadows to lunge after. His gaze was full of hatred, but it was blind hatred, without reason or meaning. It was self-destructive, destroying him from within, but at the same time deadly to all who became its object. This man didn't see innocent lives in front of him. He saw a threat, an imaginary enemy he had nurtured over the years. He stared at the house, angry thoughts bubbling in his drunken head, demanding a way out. Leela, standing behind the curtain, felt so close to death for the first time in her life. Her breathing hitched, and for a moment she thought she could hear her own heart beating in her ears. She saw those eyes that looked through her without seeing her as a human being. That look, filled with racist anger, was worse than any weapon because behind it was a system that could destroy her and her brother and justified that destruction. Her mind tossed between memories of happy moments and fear of what might happen in the next second. She recalled her parents' stories of how they lived in constant fear of such acts, as her grandmother had told her as a child. Never meet the gaze of those who hate you because of the way you look. They won't see you as a human being. But today Leela looked into those eyes without averting her gaze. She saw in them all the horror of the world she had been born into. Marcus stood beside his sister, his face stony, but his heart pounding so hard it seemed ready to burst his chest. He saw those eyes, too, and there was no pity in them. There was a hunger for humiliation, a malicious pleasure in making someone else feel afraid. He clenched his fists, knowing they were powerless against this system, but also realizing that if he had to, he would stand between that hatred and his sister to protect her at all costs. Officer Baird's eyes, filled with racist anger, were like fire, ready to scorch everything in its path. There was no justice in this night, no defense against evil. There was only fear and the realization that the whole world could collapse in 1 second because someone like this man thought himself superior to others, better, more worthy. In that look was all the horror of racism, its cruelty and ruthlessness, and there was no escape from that fear. Leela stood in the center of the room, like a frowning figure in a nightmare from which it was impossible to escape. The warmth of the plaid she still held in her hands seemed now almost a mockery of the chilling horror that gripped her heart. Her eyes widened and her breathing became intermittent, like someone on the verge of a panic attack. Her body knew what it meant to be in danger, even if her mind hadn't yet had time to comprehend what was happening. She heard every sound: Officer Baird's heavy footsteps, the baton striking the metal bars of the gate, the hoarse breathing filled with anger. The fear she felt seemed to be something alive, a dark creature crawling over her skin. Leela felt like a cornered animal, cornered in a corner, and that corner was her home, the very place that was supposed to be her safe fortress. She realized her vulnerability, her defenselessness to the force that was closing in on them. The house she'd grown up in, the walls soaked with her memories and family love, now seemed too fragile, as if they could be broken with a single blow. Her thoughts darted around, looking for salvation, but there was no salvation. She knew it was futile to call the police, because the threat now stood just outside the door, wearing the uniform that was supposed to protect. Confusion pierced her, paralyzing her mind. Leela thought of all those who had experienced something similar, those who were innocent but still victimized, about those who shouted for help but no one came. Stories of racist attacks, of murders motivated by hate and injustice, came alive in her mind. Each name, each victim a reminder of the brutality of the world they lived in. She felt that she and Marcus could be the next names on that tragic list. Her hands were shaking, tears ran down her cheeks, and she tried to hold them back. But it was impossible. The tears were an echo of all the pain, all the injustice that was building up inside her. She remembered her mother telling her about the years of fear when she had to hide from patrols or endure scornful looks. Leela knew that her mother had dreamed of her children living in a world where they wouldn't have to fear for their lives just because they were born black. But that world had not yet come, and Leela stood face to face with a terrible truth. She turned around and met Marcus's gaze. He was her older brother, her protector since childhood, but now he looked confused, too. His eyes raced around the room looking for something, a way out, a weapon, anything to protect them, but they had no way out. No weapons. They were just children, thrown into this world where their skin color made them targets. Leela felt like a little, helpless girl that the world was always trying to crush. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, as if choked by all the horror that surrounded her. She realized, here and now, on this night, no one would come to their rescue. They were alone, vulnerable, open to being struck. Her heart was breaking with despair. She felt Marcus squeeze her hand, his palm warm and strong, but even that connection couldn't dispel the feeling of hopelessness. They stood together, but what could the young people do against a system that had oppressed them for centuries? Leela knew they were mere children in the face of a cruel reality that could destroy them with a single move, and that realization pierced through her. This moment, filled with confusion and horror, was the embodiment of everything they hated about this world, a world where their lives were considered less important, a world where fear was a constant companion and salvation a rare miracle. Marcus stood motionless beside Leela, his breath coming in rapid gasps, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst at any second. He felt her trembling hand in his, felt her fear, her boundless despair, but he knew he had to be strong, that he had always been her protector, the one who had kept his sister safe when the world became too harsh, too cruel. Tonight was to be no exception, even if he had to sacrifice everything. Marcus was a few years older than Leela, and had taken on the role of big brother from childhood with a sense of responsibility that never left him. He remembered being beaten up once at school simply for being the black boy in a class where there were fewer of his kind. He was only 10 years old, but he realized even then that being black in this world meant always being on guard, always ready to defend himself. And when Leela came into his life, he swore to himself that he would never let anyone hurt her, even if he couldn't always save himself. Today that vow was being tested as never before. The trouble he'd feared all his life was at their doorstep, in the form of Officer Baird, the embodiment of all the hatred they tried to avoid for so long. Marcus saw Leela turn to him, her eyes full of fear, searching him for hope, searching him for salvation. He felt something inside him clench, and a feeling flared up in his chest, a mixture of love, desperation, and willingness to fight. He realized that he had to remain calm, that their fear could only increase the officer's power. But how can you stay calm when the nightmare that generations of your ancestors warned you about is unfolding before you? How can you not be afraid when your little sister looks at you with a pleading look in her eyes, hoping you will find a way to protect her? Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the air in the room felt heady and thick as tar. He knew that on this earth, their bonds, their family, their love for what made them stronger, but also made them vulnerable. He knew that if Baird wanted to hurt them, they would fight, but their chances were slim to none. Leela, he said quietly, trying to make his voice sound confident, though he himself could feel the fear clutching his throat. It's going to be okay. But even those words seemed hollow in a world where everything will be okay was a promise that too often failed to come true for people like them. He clenched her hand harder, trying to transfer some strength to her, even if he had almost none left. Marcus realized that everything now depended on him. He felt the responsibility for Leela so acutely that it almost drove him to pain. They had lost their father when he was just a teenager, killed in a search that was later found out to be illegal. Their mother had tried to shield them from all the horrors of the world. But how do you shield children from the very system that is supposed to protect them but instead becomes their enemy? Marcus looked at Leela again. He could see the tears streaming down her cheeks, the way she tried to hide her fear so as not to weigh his burden down. But it only made it worse. He realized that this night could be their last, that everything they had loved, everything they had fought for, could be destroyed by one cruel man with power in his hands. They were only brother and sister, young, innocent, but in Officer Baird's eyes they were something to be suppressed, a worry threat, simply because they existed. That truth, heavy as a rock, pressed down on them, but family ties bound them tighter than anything in this world. And on that terrible night, when their lives hung in the balance, the love and bond between them was the only thing that still gave them strength. Leela closed her eyes, trying to push away the horror of the present moment, and her mind drifted involuntarily to memories of those days when everything had seemed simpler, brighter, happier. She remembered their little house in a quieter time, when the walls were full of laughter and fear was something distant, seemingly having no right to enter their county or out. It was a summer day when they went to the lake as a family. The sun shone brightly, warming their skin, and Leela, then a little girl, ran through the green grass, laughing and not feeling the weight of any of the world's prejudices. Her father carried her on his shoulders, strong and kind. His loud laughter sprang through the air like bells of happiness. Her mother sat her day on a blanket preparing dinner, her eyes glowing with love and tenderness. They were not a black family in a world full of prejudice that day. They were simply a family that enjoyed every moment with each other. Marcus was a teenager then, full of life and energy. He would dive into the lake with a carefree smile on his face, competing with his father in swimming, His father would let him win, and Marcus would brag about his victory like any teenager who believes he can beat the world. Leela watched them both with admiration because they were heroes, her protectors, her paragons of strength. But those happy days were over too quickly. She remembered that terrible night when her father left and never came back. She remembered how her mother tried to comfort them. She hid her tears so she wouldn't show how her heart was breaking. The police had said something about resisting then, about legal action, but their whole family knew their father had resisted. He was just a black man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Overnight, they lost their hero, and the world grew colder, cruel and indifferent to their pain. Memories flowed through Leela's mind, intensifying the tragedy of the present. She remembered how her mother had worked even harder after her father's death, how Marcus had taken on the role of protector of the family, growing up too soon. She remembered her mother stroking her hair at night, whispering prayers for her children's safety, as if she were trying to protect them with the strength of her love. Leela knew her mother had done her best, but even that endless motherly love couldn't shield them from a world that hated them for being who they were. Those happy moments with their father, those carefree days full of sunshine and laughter, now seemed distant, almost unfulfilled. They were like broken shards of a life that had been taken from them. Because in this world full of hatred, even happiness seemed temporary, fragile, like a morning mist that easily dissipates under the harsh sun of reality. Leela opened her eyes, and they were once again faced with the harsh truth of the night. Their home, once filled with happy memories, was now a place of terror, where a monster in the shape of the law stood on their doorstep, ready to destroy what they had so desperately defended. The memories made this moment even more unbearable. After all, Leela knew that they had once had a simple dream: to live, to laugh, to love like everyone else. But this world had made even that simple dream unattainable. Next to her, Marcus remembered those happy times, too. He remembered his father, remembered his hands holding him tightly when they played ball. He remembered how his father had taught him to be strong but not cruel, how he had told him, "Your strength is that you can love even in this cruel world." Now Marcus felt that all that strength was needed to protect his sister, to hold back the world that was trying to crush them. These memories were both their strength and their weakness. They were a reminder of what they had and what they could lose at any second. Officer Baird stood in front of Leela and Marcus's house, his legs spread, baton clutched tightly in his hand like a weapon ready to bring pain. In that moment, he was more than just a man. He was the embodiment of that blind, ugly hatred that had been passed down from generation to generation, fueled by prejudice, fear, and a false sense of superiority. His face, flushed with alcohol, seemed almost inhuman. Baird was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with each breath of the warm, thick night air. His mind was filled with rage, hot and unbridled, like wildfire. This rage had not been born in one night. It had matured over the years, fed by the beliefs he had heard since childhood. Every whisper about outsiders, every mocking word about people who looked different. He grew up in a family where hatred of the other was almost a ritual, something that was passed down in table talk and jokes with venomous overtones. Baird's father, himself an ex-officer, often told him that black people were a menace, that they were the cause of all the trouble in the world. These words cut into little Baird's consciousness, poisoning his innocent mind. With each passing year, this hatred, unconscious at first, grew deeper, taking shape and purpose. When Baird joined the police force, he felt powerful. The uniform gave him power, and that power fed his dark thoughts, turning them into weapons. He saw the people he was supposed to protect as nothing but a threat. Racist thoughts, like deep-rooted weeds, adorned his perception of the world. Every black man he stopped seemed to him a potential criminal. Every black family he saw was to him the embodiment of the outsiders he considered inferior. Tonight, under the influence of alcohol, all those hidden dark thoughts had come out. Drunken hatred made him even more violent, removing all restraints and masks. He felt both strong and unjustly wronged at the same time. It seemed to him that his world, the world of real citizens, was being destroyed because of people like these people in the house. Alcohol increased his certainty of righteousness, making him almost insane. One thought pulsed through Baird's mind: they should know their place. He didn't need an excuse. His racist rage was a goal in itself. He felt like a guardian of the old order, the one where people like him had unchallenged power. Hate was his only motivation, and even if he didn't realize its senselessness, it drove his every action. He didn't see the people in front of him. He saw only the enemies he had to crush. In the depths of his soul, where there had once been simple humanity, there was now only emptiness. Baird knew no love or compassion. He didn't think about the fact that these people whose lives he could destroy also felt, loved, feared. He didn't see a brother ready to defend his sister, or a girl trembling with terror. All he saw was a threat to his false sense of superiority, his place in the world. His obsession with hate made him a monster. This monster had no need for justice, no search for truth. He craved only pain, only punishment, only suppression. On this night, Officer Baird was the embodiment of all the evil in the world, and that evil was destructive, threatening to destroy everything in its path. Baird looked up toward the house. His eyes were empty, but the fire of hatred burned in them. That look was dead. There was not a shadow of doubt in it, not a drop of compassion. Baird was no longer just a man. He was a hate machine created by a society that allowed evil to take root and flourish, wounding people who just wanted to live. On that night, which had begun as routinely as hundreds of others before it, Leela and Marcus's home had seemed like an island of safety, a refuge from a world where danger could lurk around every corner. The house was full of memories, built on the love and care of their mother, who had made it a place where the children could feel safe despite the hardships. The walls, soaked with aromas of home-cooked dinners, the sounds of children's laughter, warm hugs on cold winter nights, seemed like a fortress that nothing could destroy. But this night, safety cracked like brittle glass, and the familiar coziness began to turn into a trap. The walls that were supposed to protect them now seemed to shrink around them like cages, locking them inside, with no chance of escape. The transparent windows through which the morning sun had once shone merely now seemed like vulnerable barriers through which evil could enter at any moment. The doors they had locked every night with the confidence that they could contain the threat now seemed too thin to withstand the onslaught of hatred standing outside. Leela looked around the room. She'd always considered this living room the heart of the house. It was where she and her brother Saturday snuggled together on rainy days, reading books and sharing dreams of a future where they could be anything they wanted to be. She remembered how their mother had told them stories when they were little, how Marcus had built fortresses out of pillows, promising to protect her from all dangers. But today, that fortress couldn't protect them from the real threat that stood on their doorstep. The sound of a baton banging on the wicket rang through the room, making Leela flinch. It was a reminder that evil had already entered their world. It was the sound of a crack creeping through their safety, turning the house into a prisoner. The street outside, once seemingly peaceful, was now hostile, filled with dark hatred. Standing in the image of Officer Baird, Marcus clenched his fists, and his breathing quickened. He, too, could feel the safety slipping away, their home becoming a cage. He knew they were trapped inside, with no chance of escape. All that was left was to wait for the threat to burst through the doors. Marcus felt helpless, and the feeling was tearing him apart. He was supposed to be the protector, but how could he protect his sister from a force that was immeasurably bigger and tougher? Everything in the house was suddenly a reminder of the fragility of their world. The lamp on the bedside table, which had illuminated the room with a soft light, now seemed too bright, too exposed. It seemed that even that light might have attracted the attention of the officers behind the door, who was looking for an excuse for his hatred. The cracked floor on which they had once strewn with chalk now creaked under their feet, giving away their fear. Leela pressed herself against her brother. She felt him trembling, but she tried to hold on. They both knew that this night would never be the same. Suddenly every sound, every crack of the floor and rustle of wind outside the windows seemed like ominous portents of what was to come. The cracked security of the house reflected a deeper crack in their belief in justice, in their belief that they could live without fear. The trap shrank around them. The walls that had protected their childhood dreams now seemed like a barrier separating them from a world where equality and freedom were just pretty words, empty promises they'd heard all their lives. Officer Baird was the embodiment of this cruel truth, that their safety was an illusion, a thin shell that could be broken by one hate-filled man. Leela felt her heart beating so fast that it felt like it would burst out of her chest in a moment. The air in the room was heavy, not enough to breathe. Her body tensed, her muscles stiff. With paralyzing fear, the sounds outside grew louder and louder. They cut into her consciousness, deepening her sense of doom. Officer Baird kept hitting the wicket with his baton, like a monster that had found its prey and was hungry for its blood. Everything Leela had ever heard about injustice, about hate, violence, seemed to come at her with a terrifying force. She remembered all those stories that she tried not to take to heart, but that had always been part of their reality. She remembered the news stories of innocent people who had been arrested, beaten, killed just because they were born with a different skin color. Memories flashed before her eyes, becoming almost tangible. Her mind screamed that she had to do something, had to defend herself somehow, but her body wouldn't listen, as if frowning with terror. In that moment, Leela had nothing but her voice, a voice she suddenly felt like the only possible weapon. Gathering all her strength, despite the fear that was choking her, Leela took a step forward, moved closer to the window, and let out a scream. Help! Her voice tore through the silence of the night, piercing the air like a sharp knife. She wasn't screaming from powerlessness. She was screaming from the deepest pain, from the desire to be heard in a world that so often refused to hear. It was a cry filled with desperation, a hope that anyone would hear, someone would come to help. It was a cry not just for rescue, it was a cry for recognition of their right to life, a cry for justice that had always eluded them. But even as the sound of her voice echoed down the street, she was even more scared. Screams seemed to make everything real. She knew that in this world full of prejudice and hatred, a black girl's cry for help could go unanswered. Neighbors could have been scared, could have been reluctant to intervene. The system that was supposed to protect could have turned its back again. As it did so often, her cry could have dissolved into the night, finding no heart to respond. Leela held her breath, listening to see if there was the sound of footsteps somewhere, if any of the neighbors would come out, if anyone would run to their aid. But everything remained disturbingly quiet. It was as if the world had frowning, indifferent and deaf to her pain. It was as if the air itself had absorbed her despair, not about to give it back. She felt her eyes fill with tears. Those tears were a mixture of anger and powerlessness. She knew this was a world where their voices were too often ignored, a world where a black girl's cry could mean nothing. The thought pounded in her head. What if no one comes? What if we're alone again? And that realization hit her harder than any physical pain. Marcus hugged his sister, trying to give her strength, though he felt the ground shifting from under his feet. He realized that this cry for help might not be heard, because they lived in a world where such cries were often drowned out by indifference and prejudice. But he was grateful for this cry, for Leela's courage. It was a way of telling the world that they existed, that they deserved to be heard, even if the world didn't want to hear them. Outside, Officer Baird grinned. He thought the scream was a sign of weakness, and it only fueled him more. In his eyes, Leela and Marcus were mere targets, people to be ignored, suppressed, destroyed. Her cry for help didn't touch his heart. His heart had long been frowning with hatred. Leyland's cry dissipated into the night, like a flickering light going out in the deep darkness. The world around them remained deaf and indifferent, and with that indifference, it became clearer and clearer. They were alone at this moment, facing a monster in human form. Officer Baird, hearing the girl's scream, tensed and his face contorted into a vicious grin, like a predator who found pleasure in the fear of his prey. It was the moment when the hatred that had been building up in him was about to burst forth. He stepped slowly through the gate, which creaked as if the earth itself groaned at the approaching threat. His heavy footsteps sounded like the seconds of a menacing metronome. Each step brought him closer to the door of the house, and with each thump of his boots on the ground, Leela and Marcus felt the noose around their necks tighten even more. It was the sound of fate bringing destruction with it. Baird stopped in front of the door. He exhaled hot alcoholic vapor like a dragon spitting out poison. His eyes glittered in the light of the street lamps, reflecting cruelty and rage. He tapped the wooden door with his baton, and the sound was horrible, like the harbinger of a storm banging on the windows before it came crashing down with destructive force. In his hand, the baton swung up and down like a pendulum, ready to fall on anyone. Come out, Baird bellowed, his voice full of venom, full of contempt, full of a hatred that needed no justification whatsoever. Come on, come out and show your black faces. He said it with such venomous satisfaction, as if he already knew that everything was under his control, that his power was absolute and unquestionable. Leela shrank back against the wall. Those words cut her heart like blades. She knew that behind the contempt was a whole history of oppression, a whole system that had brought people of her color to their knees for centuries. This officer's was just the embodiment of old prejudices that never went away, just changed guise but never truly disappeared. His words were a reminder that her life, her existence, would never mean as much to the likes of him as the lives of others. Marcus gritted his teeth, his hands clenched into fists, but he knew that physical resistance would be tantamount to signing his sentence. He stood, holding back the anger that boiled in his blood, holding back the urge to shout back, to show that they would not surrender, would not give in to this hatred. But what could he do against a man armed not only with a baton, but with the power of a system that supported men like Bayard? You think you can hide? The officers continued, his voice growing more and more aggressive, filled with sadistic pleasure. You think your pathetic existence means anything? He took another step forward, and the baton hit the wooden door jamb, leaving a dent in it with every word he spoke, every drop of poison that wound seed from his mouth. Night grew more terrifying, becoming a nightmare from which there was no escape. Leela felt the fear take over her completely. Her body trembled, but in her eyes, despite the terror, the fire of human dignity still burned. She wanted to scream, wanted to shout back that they were human, that they deserved to live, that they deserved to be heard. But fear choked her, squeezing her throat, turning her scream into a silent plea for salvation. Officer Bayard was close, too close, and it was like the realization that fate had caught up with them. This night was a test of their strength, their faith, their love, and every step Bayard took was the first blow of fate, bringing with it all the pain and injustice of the world they lived in. Leela stood with her back against the wall, as if trying to blend in, to become invisible, to disappear, but the walls couldn't protect her, couldn't make her invisible to the hatred that was coming closer and closer. She felt the air grow thick, pressurized, as if the world around her had frowning, waiting to see what would happen next. Fear gripped her body with an icy grip, robbing her of the ability to move, robbing her of the strength to even breathe. But her heart wouldn't submit to the stupor. It pounded so furiously that it seemed to be beating so furiously that it could be heard across the room. Boo, 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 boo. The sounds of her heart merged with Officer Bayard's heavy footsteps outside the door, and the combination seemed an ominous symphony of fear. Her palms sweated, and her fingers involuntarily clawed at the thin edge of her dress, as if that fabric could hold her to reality, to a world where she could escape. Her chest squeezed so hard she feared she couldn't breathe. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't even notice them. Her whole being was gripped by a terror that was both personal and shared, a legacy passed down to her and her brother in this world where every moment of life had to be fought for. She remembered all the stories her mother had told her about how to behave in such moments. Never show fear, her mother used to say. Stay calm, don't respond with aggression, but if you are threatened, if you feel you can't save yourself, scream. Scream as loud as you can, so that the world knows you're here, so that at least someone will try to help. But Leela had already screamed, and the world went deaf, leaving her and Marcus alone with the threat. Officer Bayard, outside the door, seemed the living embodiment of a nightmare. His presence was felt physically, like a black, crushing cloud of hatred. Leela could hear him moving, his breathing growing heavier, and the sound made her shiver harder. She felt tiny, helpless, like a little girl hiding in a dark room where the monster was about to find her. But this wasn't a childish fear, it was fear of reality. Fear that her life and her brother's life could be cut short this night simply because they were born with a different skin color. Her feet seemed chained to the floor, as if heavy chains were attached to them. She wanted to run away, but where to? Even if she could move, she knew that a door or window wouldn't be able to save her. This house that had once been her refuge was now a trap. A daze took over her mind. Her thoughts jumbled, preventing her from finding a way out. Her mind kept repeating only one thought. Why us? Why does this hatred never go away? But in this ocean of fear, Leela could feel her heart not giving up. It was pounding, resisting, fighting. The rhythm was a reminder that she was alive, that she existed, that her life mattered, even if Officer Bayard and the world he represented tried to prove otherwise. Her fear was great, but her desire to live, her desire to be heard, her desire to fight for her life was even stronger, even though it was hidden behind that terror. She took a deep breath, trying to suppress the tears, but her body continued to shake. In that moment, Leela was like a severed nerve, her hope being a screaming reminder that every moment could be her last. But there was something else burning in her eyes, a desire not to give up, despite the fear that filled her entire being. Marcus felt a wave of fear and despair wash over him, but in the chaos, there was one clear, unchanging thought. I have to protect her. Leela, his little sister, stood nearby, slumped against the wall, her face pale and her eyes full of terror. She was his blood, his family, his everything. He couldn't let anyone, especially this man, blinded by hatred, take her life, take her future. Marcus gathered all his strength, all his memories of the days when he had promised himself to protect Leela, even if it cost him everything. He remembered how they'd played in the yard, how she laughed when he tossed her in the air and she'd squealed with joy. He remembered how they had Saturday in the dark after her father died, when Leela had cried and he had whispered to her that he would never leave her, that he would always be there to protect her. Tonight he had to fulfill that promise, even if fear raged in his heart, even if everything in the world was against them. Officer Baird continued to pound on the door with his baton, his voice growing more and more angry. Come out, I said, or I'll come in myself and show you what it means to disrupt order. Those words echoed around the room, filling the air with deadly menace. Leela clenched even tighter, her eyes filling with tears she could no longer hold back. Marcus felt a fire ignite in his chest. It was a mixture of anger, pain, and an indomitable desire to protect his sister. He knew he couldn't let Leela see him scared. He had to be her hero. Leela, he said quietly, trying to make his voice sound firm and confident, though inside he was shaking like a leaf in the wind. She looked up at him, her eyes full of terror, searching him for strength. He squeezed her hand so she could feel his warmth, his determination. I am with you, always, he said, and in his words was the strength of all the love he had ever felt for his sister. Marcus took a step forward, separating himself from Leela, getting between her and the door, behind which evil lurked. It was the scariest thing he had ever done, but he knew he had to do it. He felt his legs shaking, but his back straightened and his hands clenched into fists. It was an act of courage that was not without fear, but that fear only strengthened his resolve. He was ready to stand to the last man, protecting her. Officer Baird was still stomping out the door, his shadow even more intimidating in the street light. Marcus knew a confrontation was inevitable. He knew he was facing a man who saw him as an enemy only because of the color of his skin, a man whose hatred had clouded his eyes, robbing him of the ability to see people in them. This was a battle Marcus had no chance of winning. He was unarmed, unprotected, but his weapon was his love for his sister, his unwavering belief that her life was worth all the sacrifice. He inhaled deeply, trying to suppress the tremor in his voice. If you want something, take it from me, he shouted, his voice piercing the air with pain and anger. Leave my sister alone. He knew those words could have signed his death warrant, but he couldn't do otherwise. Marcus stood like a wall between Leela and danger, and in this moment he was her hero, the hero she deserved. He was willing to sacrifice everything for her safety, even if his heart was racing with anxiety. Leela looked at her brother, her eyes full of tears but also full of admiration. In that moment, she saw him in all his bravery, and her heart burst with love and pain. She knew he was willing to sacrifice himself for her, and the thought was unbearable. Marcus stood between her and hate as the last bastion of hope, and this night was the worst night of their lives. But in his determination, she found a glimmer of light in the darkness. The power of fear might have shackled them, but the love that held them together was stronger. Marcus stood in front of the door, his body tense as a string ready to burst from an overabundance of emotion. His hands were trembling. He couldn't hide it, no matter how much he tried to look strongly in front of Leela. Those trembling hands that had once lifted her into the air to squeal with happiness were now the only barrier between his sister and the monster that was preparing to break into their home. He felt the weight of their responsibility, like a weight pressing him into the ground. Never in his life had he felt so small, so vulnerable. The power he had to exude to calm Leela seemed a mere illusion, a flimsy facade hiding a boiling ocean of fear. But Marcus couldn't allow himself to back down. He knew that if he broke, if he showed weakness, they would lose everything. He had to stay firm, even if his body gave away his fear. Officer Beard kept banging on the door with his baton, and the blows were like hammer blows to their fragile reality. The sound echoed in Marcus's head, amplifying every doubt he had, every horrible scenario he could imagine. He realized that the man in front of him was not just a man, but the embodiment of a system that for centuries had deemed men like him unworthy, disenfranchised, without protection. The officer was not just a man with a gun. He was part of a structure that had taken lives time after time without accountability. Flashes of memories rushed into Marcus's mind. He remembered his grandmother's stories of how her uncle had disappeared in a time when lynchings were the norm. He remembered his father teaching him to always be wary because in this world, his skin color was not just a part of his identity, but a target to be seen by those who hated. He remembered every news story about those who had been killed, every face that had become a symbol of injustice. And now, standing in front of that door, he realized that they could be next. The trembling in Marcus's arms intensified, and he felt sweat dripping down his forehead. He wished he were stronger, wished his body would submit to his will and stop showing fear. But how can you not be afraid when you're just a young boy standing in the way of a grown man with a gun, backed by a system that had always given him the right to be superior? Marcus realized the unfairness of the situation, but he couldn't let it break him. He turned to look at Leela. Her face was wet with tears, and there was horror in her eyes. But she was looking at him, and there was pleading and faith in her gaze. In that moment, Marcus knew he had to be steadfast, not for his own sake, but for hers. He had to be her shield, even if the shield was made of flesh and blood and not steel. His love for Leela, his desire to keep her safe, was stronger than fear. "I'm here," he whispered, more to her than to himself. "I'm with you." He clenched his fists, trying to stop the shivering, but it wouldn't stop. It was a shiver not just of fear, but of rage, of realizing how unfair the world was, from the fact that a young man, must stand before this threat because their lives were never considered as valuable as the lives of others. That rage gave him strength, even if his body betrayed his fear. Officer Baird, standing outside, banged on the door once more with his baton, and the sound cut through the night. Marcus knew time was running out, but he stayed where he was, trembling but still standing. This was a test of his courage, of his love, of his faith that maybe the world would ever change. But on this night, he needed to be the shield, to be the hero Leela deserved, even if it meant giving up everything. Officer Baird's baton struck the door with such force that the wood seemed to shake with pain. Marcus instinctively gritted his teeth and tensed his muscles, preparing for the inevitable intrusion. Leela sobbed quietly behind him, and every sound of her fear tore his heart apart. He stood like a human shield between his sister and the abyss of hatred that already stretched its filthy hands toward their home. Officer Baird, feeling himself the master of the situation, grinned, though his face was contorted with anger and intoxication. He took another swing with his baton, leaving a deep dent in the door. "You think you can hide from me?" His voice cut through the silence, cold, drenched in contempt. "You think your insignificant existence can be protected? Blacks like you have always been a problem in this town. You spread filth, chaos, and disorder. And today I'm going to fix that." Those words pierced the air, leaving scars in the souls of Leela and Marcus. Leela shuddered, her eyes filling with tears that she tried to hide. She knew the hatred was deeper than words. Behind that voice was generation after generation of prejudice and violence, a system that had belittled and oppressed their people for centuries. The officer's words were like chains, pulling them to the ground, reminding them that for people like them, the world was still filled with injustice and pain. Marcus clenched his fist so hard that his nails dug into his palms, leaving painful marks. Anger and fear fought in him for supremacy, but he couldn't let the anger take over. He knew that for their kind, the slightest show of aggression was an excuse for cruelty. That was the cruel irony of their lives. They had to remain calm and composed, even when hatred stood before them, ready to destroy them. "I know you can hear me out there," Dare continued to shout, his voice growing more and more aggressive. "You people of your kind always bring trouble with you. I've seen it too, many times. Your pathetic shouting won't help you. No one will come, no one cares about you." He struck again, and that blow was like the finale to a horrifying symphony of hate. Leela looked at her brother, her eyes pleading with him to do something, to find a way out, to save them. She knew they lived in a world where justice rarely found its way to people like them. She remembered her mother teaching her to be strong, to hold her head high. But now, that strength seemed too far away. All those lessons about how to behave in a world full of hate seemed powerless in the face of the madman at the door. Marcus fought the despair that was building. He knew the officers was drunk, and he realized that he was even more dangerous in that state. Drunken rage fueled his racist hatred, making it uncontrollable and violent. But even sober, the system in which Baird served often covered for people like him, allowed them to throw their hatred around without consequence. Marcus knew the officers wasn't just a drunken racist, it was the face of a system that always considered their lives less important. He took a deep breath, his trembling hands slowly stopped shaking. It wasn't because the fear was gone, but because he knew he had to be strong for Leela. "You won't get us that easily," he whispered softly, not daring to speak louder lest he give away his weakness. There was determination in his words, but also pain at the realization of their situation, at the realization that they stood in the face of a hatred that had power over their lives. Baird stepped closer to the door, his breathing heavy, like a beast hungry for prey. He didn't see them as people. He saw only a threat to his false sense of superiority. "Are you coming out or not?" he growled, and his baton struck the door again, leaving cracks in its surface. It was a blow to their lives, to their right to exist, and it was a tragedy that they had to live. Well, the tragedy that even in their own home, in their own lives, they were never completely safe. The door shuddered under the blows of the baton, and Leela shuddered again, clamping her eyes shut, as if hoping that if she didn't see, didn't hear, the evil behind the threshold would disappear. But reality was inexorable. The blows sounded like funeral bells, each stroke penetrating her heart, shaking it in her chest. Fear gripped her completely, but her brother stood beside her, her only hope, her only defense. Marcus knew that time was almost up. Every second felt like an eternity, but he couldn't let himself relax. His mind was feverishly searching for any way out, any chance to save his sister. He realized that Baird could burst in at any moment, that this drunken, hate-obsessed man wouldn't stop until he got his way. But what could a young man do, unarmed, unsupported, in the face of a man with the power and authority to execute a massacre? Marcus clenched his fists, trying to control the rage that bubbled in his chest. It was a rage he'd known since childhood. It had built up over the years, with every injustice he'd seen, every humiliation he'd endured. He remembered how the police had stopped him once when he was just walking down the street with his friends. They were made to lie face down on the pavement, hands behind their backs, because they seemed suspicious. He was only 14 at the time. He felt the coldness of the concrete and the humiliation. But worst of all was the realization that his voice meant nothing, that his cries for justice would go unheard. Now he was facing that same hatred again, that same injustice. Only now he wasn't alone. Leela was beside him, and her life depended on him. That thought gave him strength. Even if his body was shaking, Marcus took a deep breath, and despite the terror that clutched his heart, there was determination in his eyes. He knew he couldn't defeat the officers, knew they had almost no chance, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. "Leela," his voice was quiet but firm. He turned around and looked at his sister. She opened her eyes, full of tears, and looked up at him. "Listen to me," he said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "I won't let him get to you. Do you understand? You're going to stay here, and if anything happens, you're going to run. You will run as fast as you can and not look back." His words were like blades that cut into her heart, but in them was all his love, all his care. Leela shook her head, her lips trembling. "No," she whispered, her voice almost gone. "I won't leave you." There was immense pain in her words, but also the incredible power of love. She couldn't believe her brother was willing to sacrifice himself to save her. It was unbearable, but Marcus only squeezed her hand tighter, his gaze full of determination. "You have to," he said, and there was something in his voice that silenced her. It wasn't a request, it was an order he gave with a heavy heart, knowing she hated him for it, but knowing they had no other choice. Outside, Baird waited no longer. His patience was wearing thin, and rage came over him in a wave. He raised his baton and hit the door again, harder, leaving a deep crack. "I said come out," he shouted, his voice tearing the night apart. He didn't just want to crush them anymore. He wanted to see them broken, wanted to satisfy his lust for power and violence. He was blind with hate, and that made him even more dangerous. Marcus knew that the moment of truth was approaching. He looked at Leela, his eyes full of love and pain. "I love you," he said, and in those words was all the depth of his feelings. All the weight of his sacrifice. He turned toward the door with his head up, his body still, trembling, but he stood firm. It was his last line of defense, his last act of resistance in the face of the hatred that had oppressed them all their lives. He stood, knowing he could lose, knowing he could fall victim to a system that was always against them. But even in this standing, even in this struggle, there was strength, there was honor. Marcus was willing to face evil because he knew their lives mattered. Even if the world tried to prove otherwise, and even if his hands trembled, his heart would not give up. The door rattled under the last, particularly hard blow of the baton. It seemed as if it would collapse under the onslaught of hatred outside. Leela instinctively covered her mouth with her palm to keep from screaming. Her body stiffened, and the tears that streamed down her cheeks burned her skin like hot drops. This fear was somehow primal. It pierced her to the very core of her heart. But she was even more afraid for Marcus, who stood in front of her, like the last barrier to the chaos that was coming. Marcus inhaled deeply, preparing for the worst. He could feel his heart beating so fast that it seemed ready to burst out of his chest. Fury mixed with despair raged inside him. He realized that Officer Baird was more than just a threat. This man was the embodiment of all the evil and injustice they had endured all their lives. This man had come not just to inflict pain, but to assert his false sense of superiority, his hatred directed at their very essence, at their right to exist. Baird wasn't just banning anymore, he was screaming, angrily, foaming at the mouth. "You think you can hide? You think the law is on your side?" His voice rattled like thunder, drenched in venomous satisfaction. He felt like the king of this situation, the man given the power to decide who was worthy to live and who was not. There was something monstrous, something terrifying in this certainty of rightness and power. Marcus knew that Baird would not back down. He realized that neither pleading nor screaming would stop this man, because his actions were fueled by the hatred that lived in this system. Baird was sure he would get away with it. He was sure that no justice would punish him because it had the power behind him to protect him. This realization, this terrible truth, was another blow to Marcus, but it also gave him strength. He knew he couldn't let this evil break them. Marcus clenched his hands into fists, his breathing even and calm. He looked at Leela again, trying to absorb her image, to keep her in his mind as the most precious thing in his life. He was ready for what awaited him, but he wasn't ready to see her suffer. It was the most painful thought that was tearing him up from the inside out. He had promised to protect her, and now this moment had come, the moment when his promise was going to become a reality. Suddenly the door collapsed under the onslaught, though it splintered, and Baird burst in, his eyes burning with rage and his lips curved in a hideous grin. He held the baton before him as a symbol of his power, as an instrument of his hatred. Finally, he growled, his voice full of sadistic pleasure. In this moment, he saw himself as the bringer of justice, the man who had the right to judge and punish. Leela cried out and stepped back, but Marcus stepped forward, covering her with his body. It was so fast, so instinctive, that his fear receded into the background. His hands were still shaking, but he wasn't thinking about his fear anymore. He was looking into Baird's eyes, seeing in them all the hatred, all the cruelty of the world that was embodied in this man. "Don't touch her," Marcus said, and his voice sounded firm. Though everything inside screamed with terror, he knew that this moment could be his last, knew that in this second, his fate hung in the balance, but he also knew he wouldn't back down. He was willing to give up everything to keep her safe, to keep this man from harming her. Baird grinned, his gaze flashing with malicious fire. He savored this fear, this weakness he saw before him. "You think you can threaten me?" His voice was soaked with contempt. He raised his baton, ready to deliver the blow that would shatter their world. Sever that then, thread of hope that bound brother and sister together. But even in this moment, as death and hatred loomed over them, Marcus did not back down. He knew that his life could have ended here, that his struggle could have been in vain. But he also knew that his resistance was not just a gesture of desperation. It was a resistance and defense of all who had fought before him, in memory of all who had lost their lives in a world full of injustice. And in this act of courage, in this last stand in the face of evil, was all the strength of his love and all the pain they had felt all their lives. Death was in the air, and fear was so close you could feel it, but Marcus stood as the last bastion of humanity, as a symbol that their lives mattered, even if the world didn't want to admit it. Time seemed to freeze at the moment Baird burst into their house, his baton in the air, ready to strike Marcus. It was a moment in which past, present, and future merged into a single point, the point where life could be cut short. Layla, standing behind her brother's back, seemed immersed in a silent vacuum of terror. She looked at Marcus, her eyes full of tears, begging for a miracle, for their face to suddenly change, for someone, something to intervene and save them. Her gaze was full of despair and immense love. She knew he was standing there, ready to take on the fury of this cruel world for her, but her heart ached at the sacrifice. Layla wanted to scream, to beg her brother to retreat, to run, to save herself, but her voice would not find a way out. She was paralyzed, her breath frozen in her chest, and in that brief moment that seemed like an eternity, she realized she might lose him. Marcus met his sister's gaze. He saw in her eyes everything that was important to him in this world. Her pleading gaze pierced his soul, shattered his resolve, because he didn't want her to remember him like that, trembling, afraid, but still facing danger. He wanted her to remember their happy moments, how they laughed and shared dreams, but he also knew he had no choice. His duty was to her, to the memories they'd created, to all the promises he'd made when he'd sworn to protect her. Officer Baird looked at them, and there was nothing human in his eyes. There was not a shred of doubt, not a trace of compassion. He saw before him the men whom society had taught him to despise. He saw them as a threat, as criminals, simply because they existed. His mind, clouded by alcohol and racist beliefs, was far from the mind of a man who could see others as equals. In this officers lived the very system that had oppressed people like Leah and Marcus for centuries, the very hatred that had passed through generations, bringing destruction and pain. "You're nothing," Baird spat out angrily, raising his baton even higher. His words were like a spit in the face, a reminder that their lives, in his opinion, were worth nothing. He relished this power, this opportunity to bring them to their knees, to destroy their dignity, their right to live. It was a moment of absolute injustice, a moment when the system showed its ugly face, when a man in a uniform meant to protect became an instrument of destruction. Marcus felt his knees shake, but he forced himself to stand up straight. He didn't look at Baird anymore. He only looked at Layla. Her tears were streaming down her cheeks and her lips were trembling with a held-back cry. In her gaze, he saw his sister, the little girl he had held in his arms as she cried, the girl he had promised a world where she would be safe. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, but on this night, in this moment, he couldn't lie. Everything was awful. Everything was wrong, and his heart was breaking with that realization. "Layla," his voice sounded like a whisper, full of love and sadness. "You have to be strong." Those words were a final plea for her not to let this world break her spirit, even if he himself couldn't survive. But Layla couldn't accept it. Her heart was being torn apart. "No," she whispered through her tears, her voice weak, almost disappearing in the hum of their terror. "You can't leave me. Please, Marcus, don't." Her pleading look was her last attempt to hold him, to keep him from sacrificing himself. Baird was ready to strike. His baton hovered in the air, and there was not a shadow of doubt in his face. It was a moment when death and hate could erase everything. Hope, love, life itself. But even in the face of that horror, Marcus stood, trembling but unshaken. He was the hero his sister deserved, the hero who didn't back down even as his world crumbled. Layla, covered in tears, prayed silently, begging for a miracle, for something, someone to stop this evil. And in that pleading gaze, full of love and despair, was all the strength of their struggle, all the pain of a generation that had suffered centuries of hatred and injustice. Baird raised his baton over his head, his muscles tensed and his face contorted with a mixture of rage and satisfaction. In that moment, his actions were no longer just the gesture of an individual. In that swing was the entire history of violence and oppression, the invisible weight that black families had carried on their shoulders for generations. It wasn't just a baton, it was a symbol of a system that for centuries had refused to recognize them as equal, as worthy, as important. Marcus saw death closing in on him. This weapon, this instrument of cruelty, coming to crush him. It was as if time had slowed down. In that instant, he realized that the life he had been given could be cut short in one brief moment. Everything he had fought for, everything he wanted to protect, was on the line from being destroyed. He knew he had no control over this situation, and that was the cruelest realization of all. He was a man who had been stripped of power even over his own destiny, because before him stood an officer protected by the impenetrable wall of the system. Leela felt her heart tearing to pieces. Her brother, her protector, her friend stood in the face of violence that threatened to destroy everything she knew. Her eyes widened with horror, her body stiffened, and she realized how unfair this situation was. Why were their lives at stake just because of the color of their skin? Why were they forced to fight for their existence in a world that had so often rejected them? But at that moment, something happened. A barely perceptible sound cut through the silence, breaking the frowning symphony of fear. Someone shouted outside, a woman's voice echoing through the night air. "What are you doing? Leave them alone." It was the voice of a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harris, who lived on the same street. She stood on her porch, trembling but brave, holding a telephone from which she had obviously already called the police. This shout pierced Officer Baird, his face contorted with irritation for a moment. He looked over his shoulder, clearly not expecting any of his neighbors to dare intervene. But what happened next was even more unexpected. Several other people started coming out of their homes, some with cell phones in their hands with the camera turned on. Some were yelling, some were just silently recording. Baird saw the number of witnesses growing, and it shook his confidence for a moment. Marcus and Leela, still standing in the house, frowsy, unable to believe their eyes. The neighbors who had seemed so indifferent to them were now coming out, their faces full of concern and determination. It was like a miracle, but not without a bitter aftertaste. Why did they need the intervention of others to protect their lives? Why did they have to rely on someone deciding to intervene to keep them from being killed? Baird clenched his jaws. His power, his confidence that he could do whatever he wanted, was shaken, but his hatred had not subsided. He still held the baton, his hands still shaking with anger. "Get inside," he bellowed to his neighbors, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. He knew these cameras, these people, could be the cause of his defeat. The system protected him, but not until there were witnesses ready to demand justice. Marcus felt relief come over him in a wave, but that relief was temporary. He knew that even this moment did not guarantee their salvation. Too often situations like this ended in tragedy, even when there were witnesses, even when there was a clear injustice. But in that moment, he also realized the strength of the community, the strength of those who dared to intervene. Despite the risks, Leela, trembling with fear, felt a faint glimmer of hope for the first time in a long time. But there was still pain in her heart, the pain of knowing that their safety had never been guaranteed, that their lives had always hung in the balance in a world where their rights were considered less important. She looked at Marcus, and they met gazes of gratitude, pain, at the strength they shared in this terrible moment. The specter of injustice still hung around, a reminder of how many lives had already been broken by this hatred, by this system. But in this night, amidst the fear and pain, there was something else, the ghostly light of hope that the world would someday change, and their cries for help would someday be heard. Marcus stood, his body still in a fear-induced stupor, but there was a faint sense of relief in his chest. But that relief was as fragile as glass, ready to shatter at any second. His hands were still shaking, his heart was still pounding, and Leela, standing behind him, continued to watch the scene unfolding before them with a horror that would not abate. There were too many shadows in their house, too many memories of a life of injustice and pain. Officer Baird looked around like an animal suddenly surrounded by a pack of predators. His confidence, so boundless in the beginning, had cracked. Neighbors, men and women, with phones in their hands, stood in the street, their faces stern, full of silent disapproval. They were not shouting, not throwing themselves into the fray, but their presence was already a challenge to his authority, a challenge to a system that for too long had allowed the likes of Baird to administer their twisted justice without fear of repercussion. There was still hatred in the officer's eyes, and he wasn't going to give up so easily. A step forward, his baton still in hand, ready to collapse. "You think you can threaten me?" he growled, addressing not only Marcus and Leela, but also the people outside. There was contempt in his voice, contempt that his authority could be challenged, that anyone dared to stand in the way of his hatred. But this time, Marcus wasn't alone. He felt Leela squeeze his hand, her small, trembling fingers wrapped tightly around his palm. It was more than a gesture. It was a reminder that they were together, that their bond, their love was stronger than the fear that surrounded them. There was determination in her eyes, despite the tears, and it gave him strength. "You can't do whatever you want anymore," Marcus said, and his voice, though punctuated with excitement, sounded firm. They were words that were hard to say, words that defied the system, words for which too often too high a price had been paid. But in this moment, Marcus knew he had to speak, that they couldn't stay silent any longer, couldn't let this hatred win. Marcus's words seemed to break through the veil of fear, and one of the neighbors spoke. Too. It was Mr. Rogers, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood all his life. "We see, EU officers," he said, his voice loud and firm. "We're recording everything you do. We're not going to let you hurt them." The words were like a challenge, like a cry against a system that was used to suppression but now faced something stronger. Unity? Baird clenched his jaw, his fingers white on the handle of his baton. He knew the situation had changed, knew that now, with people watching, with cameras recording his every move, his hatred and rage could turn against him, but the same fire still burned in his eyes. And that was even more terrifying. He was a man used to being untouchable, a man who believed his right to be above others was sacred. "You all don't realize who you're dealing with," he growled, but his voice wasn't so confident anymore. It was a powerless expression of hatred that could no longer fully control the situation. He took a step back, his movements more uncertain, but there was still a threat in them. He looked at Marcus and Leela as enemies he would want to destroy if he had the chance. Leela squeezed her brother's hand even tighter, her heart still pounding, but she felt strength in this joint resistance. It was a cry against the system that oppressed them, a cry they could no longer suppress. They knew that this night might not be the end of their fear, that the hatred would not disappear in an instant. But on this night, they were not broken. They stood, surrounded by a people who had dared to intervene, and there was something strong in that, something that could not be so easily destroyed. The system that for centuries had put their lives below others had cracked, albeit briefly, but in that moment they felt they could breathe. Marcus and Leela stood together, trembling but unshaken, in the face of the hatred that still threatened their lives. But now they knew their voices could be heard, their lives mattered, even if the recognition required a fight that wasn't over yet. Tension was in the air, sharp and dense, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Baird stood in front of Marcus and Leela, his baton still raised threateningly, but now his confidence was beginning to crumble under the onslaught of the concerned stares of those around him. He turned around and saw the people from the houses along the street come out on their doorsteps, the small community uniting in this moment against his hatred. Mrs. Harris, the same woman whose voice had first broken the silent darkness, stood on her porch with a hard expression on her face. Her hands trembled, but there was a determination in them that was impossible to ignore. She was a black woman who had seen more than could be endured in one lifetime, who had endured years of struggle, years of pain. She knew what injustice was, knew what it meant to fear for her life and the lives of her children. But now she could no longer remain silent. "You have no right," she said, her voice trembling but filled with dignity. "We will not be silent any longer. We see you, officers, and the world will see you too." Her words were like a hammer hitting the walls of hate and fear that held people like Baird in their certainty of impunity. Marcus and Leela looked at her with gratitude and wonder. In that moment, they realized that their pain, their fear, was not invisible, that someone was willing to stand by their side, even if it didn't undo all the horrors they had already endured, even if it didn't remove the wounds that were already in their hearts. But that situation was still dangerous. Officer Baird clenched his teeth, his eyes blazing with a hatred that was impossible to hide. He turned to the men who now stood before him, armed only with their phones and a determination to record everything that was happening here. It was a threat to him, a reminder that his actions would no longer go unnoticed. He was used to being strong, used to his power being absolute, but now that was changing, and he hated it. "You better disperse," he growled, his voice full of anger but with a note of panic in it. "You're interfering with police duties." But no one moved from their seats. People stared at him without taking their eyes off him, their faces full of anger and disgust at his violence. They were a small but powerful wall of resistance, and their presence was a challenge Baird had not expected. At that moment, a siren wailed from around the street corner. Blue and red lights flashed in the distance, approaching at an alarming speed. Someone else had called the police, and now, officers not expected were on their way. It was an unexpected intervention, another variable no one could have predicted. The wail of sirens cut through the night, bringing with it the fear of an unknown outcome. Baird frowned for a moment. He knew that the approaching policeman could either support him or aggravate his situation. Thoughts flashed through his mind. How to get out of it, how to justify his aggression. He had been part of this system for too long not to understand how it worked, how it could be manipulated to get away with it. But he also knew that the cameras that were still pointed at him and the witnesses that were looking in his direction could change everything. Marcus felt the tension in the room ease a little. He was still standing in front of Leela, his hands no longer shaking so violently, but the fear hadn't gone anywhere. They had been through too much to believe in a simple miracle, to believe it would end so easily. But in that moment, as the sirens blared closer and closer, he felt a tiny spark of hope break through the gloom. Leela, covered in tears, looked at her brother. Her eyes were still full of pain, but she saw that they were no longer alone. She saw the people near their home sticking together, like a community that was there to support them through this night of terror. And while that support couldn't erase the past, it gave them a sense that their voices weren't completely lost. Officer Baird took another step back, his eyes darting between the approaching police officers and the crowd that continued to draw. He gripped his baton even tighter, his face flaming with rage. But now it wasn't just anger, it was desperation, the desperation of a man whose power was beginning to crumble under the weight of public condemnation. And in that moment, Leela and Marcus realized that their struggle was not just their own personal tragedy. It was a struggle for their entire community, for all those who lived in fear, for those who fought for their right to be heard. The howling of the sirens became a cry against the system, a system that had always refused to recognize them as equals, a system that still oppressed them and hurt them. But on this night, they felt that their pain, their fear, could be seen. The sirens grew louder and louder, tearing the night air with their alarming howls. Their glow flooded the street with flashing light, and there was something unbearably ironic about those pulsing lights. It was a light that was supposed to bring safety, but to Marcus and Leela, those blue-red flashes were not a symbol of protection. They knew too many stories of how the police had failed to come to their aid, how they had become a source of violence instead of a shield, how the law that was supposed to protect had turned against them. Baird was still standing by the ruined door, his face flushed with anger, his hands clutching, his baton so white his knuckles turned white. He knew that now he would have to justify himself. Now his actions would be under close scrutiny, and that made him furious. He was used to being untouchable, used to getting away with everything. The system he was a part of supported him, and others like him gave them power that was rarely challenged. But now, he was trapped in his own rage, surrounded by people who had finally reared their heads. Police cars braked at the sidewalk with a screech of tires, and several officers jumped out of them. Their guns were at the ready, their faces focused, but there was no confidence in their eyes. They saw the crowd, the phones pointed in their direction, and the realization that the situation was already beyond their usual scenario. They met the challenge, the strength of a community that had decided not to be silent. One of the officers, clearly a senior officer, approached Baird. "What's going on here?" His voice was stern, but you could hear the awkwardness in it, the realization that the situation had been overly escalated. Baird turned to him, his face still burning with rage, but he tried to hide it behind a mask of professionalism. "Those men," he said, his voice trailing off, but he quickly pulled himself together. "They threatened me. I defended myself." Baird's words hung in the air like a light that tried to justify violence. But this time, witnesses standing outside didn't let that light go unpunished. He broke into their house, shouted someone in the crowd. "We saw the whole thing." The people were filled with anger and determination, and this anger was not just from the night, but from the entire history of suffering their community had endured. It was a cry against the lies, a cry against the injustice that had taken the lives of their friends, their brothers and sisters, time after time. Leela stood next to Marcus, her hands still shaking, tears rolling down her cheeks. Her body was exhausted, but her spirit was not broken. She looked at the police officers, at the crowd, at the ruined door that symbolized everything that was wrong in this world. The night was over, but her wounds, the wounds of their entire community, remained open, bleeding. She knew that even if Baird received his punishment, even if he faced the consequences, the system that had bred his hatred would not change so easily. Marcus squeezed her hand. He felt exhausted, drained to the core. He knew they had lived through a nightmare that would leave a lifelong mark. He knew that the fear they had experienced would come back to them again and again. He looked at the officers, at their hesitant movements, at the way they tried to hold themselves with confidence, but now knew that their every action was being recorded. He realized that the fight for justice was far from over. The senior officers looked at the shattered door, at Marcus and Leela, whose faces were still contorted with pain and fear. He didn't know what to do. The system he was a part of had always taught him to protect his own, but now he had to face the realization that perhaps his own were at fault. He stepped forward, holstering his weapon, and tried to soften his voice. "We'll handle this," he said, but neither Marcus nor Leela had any faith in his words. Everything that happened that night was too painful, too real. It was a truth that was repeated over and over again for people like them. Leela and Marcus knew that they still had a long road of healing to go through, if that was even possible. They knew that many nights like this had happened in this world, that many people had never survived, never been able to tell their story, and they knew that this struggle, the struggle for the right to live, to be heard, was far from over. The system that spawned men like Baird was still alive, and even if this night ended, even if this officers was punished, the root of the evil would remain. But on this night, amidst the fear and the pain, there was another force, a force of unity, a force of people who could no longer remain silent. The night, full of fear and pain, finally began to recede before the coming dawn. The blue lights of the police cars still flickered, but their glow was no longer the main source of light. The sun was slowly appearing over the horizon, coloring the sky with warm hues, as if to remind them that after the darkest moments, dawn always comes. For Leela and Marcus, the night had been an ordeal that left indelible wounds, but along with the pain came the realization that they were not alone. The senior officers finally ordered two of his subordinates to remove Baird from the premises. The officers resisted, his face flaming with anger and shame, but now, under the pressure of witnesses and cameras, he had no choice. People continued filming, watching every move to make sure that justice, at least this time, would be served. Mrs. Harris, who was in the front, rose, crossed herself, and quietly whispered a prayer, grateful that the tragedy had not turned into a disaster. Marcus stood on the threshold of his ruined house, still holding Leela's hand. Both of them were exhausted, but in that moment there was a bond between them, stronger than ever before. It was a bond not only of love and kinship, but of strength developed through fighting. Marcus looked at Leela, his eyes filled with tears, but they weren't just tears of fear, they were tears of relief and love. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against him, as if he was afraid that if he let go, something might try to separate them again. Leela sobbed and clutched at his shirt, her face wet with tears, but something new was beginning to stir in her soul. It was a feeling she rarely allowed herself to experience in a world full of hope. She saw the people from their neighborhood who had come out of their homes and stood around them, forming a ring of support and protection. These people were their neighbors, their community, and tonight they became something more. They became their saviors, people who decided they could no longer stay away. Mrs. Harris walked over to Leela and Marcus, her eyes filled with tears too, but her voice was firm. "We are here with you," she said. Her words were simple, but in them was the depth of her experience, her struggle. "We will fight for you, for each and every one of us. We will not allow ourselves to be treated like this again." There was a strength in her voice that pierced the morning, reminding everyone that even in the darkest of nights there is room for resistance. Marcus and Leela knew they had a long road ahead of them. They would have to tell their story, they would have to relive the nightmare over and over again, trying to get justice. But now they knew they were not alone. That knowledge was like a shield that gave them the strength to move forward. The pain they had endured would stay with them forever. But on this night, they saw that there were people in their community who were willing to stand with them, to share the burden, to support them. Baird was led away, his resistance no longer strong, his hatred met with a wall of voices that finally decided not to be silent. But Leela and Marcus realized that the problem was deeper than a single officer's. The problem was the system that had created people like Baird, allowed hate to exist and thrive. It was a long journey of struggle, a journey that began long before they were born and continued with each new generation. They returned to their home, now destroyed and battered, but it was their home. Neighbors offered help, someone brought blankets, someone offered to sleep over, someone just hugged them and told them that they were here, that they were near. This support was a light in their dark reality. Leela looked at those faces, at the people who could no longer stay away, and it gave her strength she didn't even know she possessed. The morning was fresh, the air seemed full of promise. Marcus sighed deeply, his eyes still full of pain, but he held on tighter now. He realized that they still had a lot of work to do. But now, holding Leela's hand, standing in front of their ruined home, he knew that their fight mattered, and perhaps one day, in this world, their children or their children's children would live without fear of those who must protect. And in that first ray of light, in this morning after a nightmare, they stood together, knowing that their lives mattered, that their voices could be heard. It was a fight for justice, for a world where hatred would no longer determine their fates. If this story touched you or evoked strong emotions, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you had an experience with racism or injustice in your life? How have you dealt with these situations? And what do you think could help make the world a fairer place for all? You are incredibly important to us. Each of you is a unique part of our community, and we deeply appreciate your support, your voices, and your courage to share your stories. Your thoughts help us grow and fight together for equality, justice, and respect. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and give us a like if this topic is close to your heart. It really helps us promote important stories and discuss topics that mean so much to all of us. We wish you a good and bright day. May there be more love, support, and unity in your surroundings.